thank you for joining us today. My name is Catherine Van Ness, and I am the Senior Policy Analyst for K-12 Education here at the National Governors Association. Welcome to NGA's webinar on strategies for supporting students with disabilities during and beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. This webinar will highlight lessons learned during the past year and a half and share strategies for supporting students with disabilities, including when it comes to academic recovery and meeting their holistic needs. Please note that this is the fourth in an ongoing Reflect and Redesign series of webinars that will look at lessons learned during the pandemic and elevate state and local exemplars that can inform gubernatorial efforts during and beyond the pandemic. Please check out our earlier webinars on state education budgets, re-engaging students, and summer learning and enrichment at the NGA website. And be on the lookout for forthcoming webinars on student and staff well-being and engaging families and communities. Today, I am pleased to engage in conversation with two national experts on a very important topic. Lindsay Jones is the president and CEO of the National Center for Learning Disabilities, a nonprofit organization that promotes innovation, research, and advocacy to improve the lives of the 1 in 5 with learning disabilities and attention issues. And Lauren Miranda-Rhim is the executive director and co-founder of the Center for Learner Equity, an organization committed to ensuring that students with disabilities, particularly those in under-resourced communities, have the quality educational opportunities and choices they need to thrive and learn. As I said, this is such an important topic, so I want to jump right in. Lindsay, can you provide our audience today with some context to set the scene here? Who are students with disabilities in homes and schools across the country?
Absolutely, and thanks so much for having us today and featuring this important topic. I think the most important thing to say at the top is every single classroom in every state in our nation basically has a student with a disability in it. So no longer are we working under a model where students with disabilities are solely served in separate settings, and that has huge and profound implications for the whole system and the way governors and states approach education. Students with disabilities range from students who have very significant needs to those who are in the gen ed classroom almost the entire day, working one-on-one with a general education teacher, and whose needs are still significant, but appear in a much different light. So we have 13 different categories of students with disabilities. And the reason those categories exist is a long sort of historical path to get there, but it does actually represent a very large population of students, and one that's been growing over the last 10 years as we get better understanding of students' needs. And in response to COVID, the need to personalize for all students and individualize for all students has definitely risen in our conversation. And that is something where there's a great history in special education of providing individualized services. So for students with disabilities, they have a legal right to a free, appropriate public education. And there are students who have, as I said, they cover these 13 categories. Now, Catherine, you just said the National Center for Learning Disabilities addresses the 1 in 5. And our focus is on those students with learning disabilities like reading, writing, math, and attention issues. And these are largely invisible disabilities. They're brain-based learning and attention issues, and they're the largest category of students with disabilities. They're almost entirely served in the entire day in general education classrooms. So our general education teachers are being supported by other educators in the room. You'll also see students with disabilities who have more significant needs, and those are students with significant cognitive disabilities, with physical disabilities, and with a whole range of other types of needs and services that schools provide to them. They may be in separate settings for portions of the day, but they're spending, and they should be included in your general education planning and curriculum for the whole as much as they can be, in the least restrictive environment is what we say. So I think the important thing to remember is there's a huge range of students with disabilities, and we can be leaning on those educators and professionals who work with them and individualize and have for years to create a better system for all of our students, whether they have disabilities or not. It's a critical time for that.
Yeah, and I thank you. I would, it's really great to be here. Thanks for having us. I would echo everything Lindsay said and just add one other point was that while there is a huge range of disabilities, the research indicates the vast majority of kids with disabilities can be included in the general ed classroom and be successful and should reasonably be expected to perform on par with their peers. And so even thinking of looking at some of the data, the percentage of kids who have cognitive impairments, it's reasonable to expect to 85% of the kids with disabilities should be meeting grade level standards and performing on par. And I think that's a data point that a lot of times people are surprised by, and it's always important to find out.
Absolutely. Thank you both for providing that important context. And I really appreciate the focus on the lessons that the general ed community can take from the services that have been provided to students with disabilities through that individualization and really planning to meet their needs. I think we've seen that across the board as parents have become more intimately familiar with their students' learning needs, and teachers have also been able to gain the technical resources to help provide more of that personalization in some places. So to dive into that a little bit further, we know that governors across the country have really focused extensively on closing the digital divide during the pandemic. We know that over 90% of students now have those devices that they need to learn remotely when necessary, and have much better access to internet and connectivity and broadband. But what were some of the challenges that emerged during remote learning situations for students with disabilities? And were there any particularly successful strategies in reaching them during those periods? Or if not, where did you see that fall short, and what can be done to improve in the future? And Lauren, I'll turn it to you first.
We've definitely made great gains in terms of, as you said, device and internet access, and making sure that, one-to-one, that we heard early on stories of, family with 3 kids all trying to work on one device. And so it is important to acknowledge that progress, and that's been really helpful in the internet access. For students with disabilities, I think it was, multifaceted. It was for students who use any kind of specialized devices, were they able to get them into the homes for them? And then did parents know how to use them? Were they able to get access to their general ed teacher as well as their special ed teacher to make accommodations as we switch to remote learning? And, it's important to acknowledge that the overnight pivot that schools had to make, and to give them some grace as they were working to try to do that, to make it work for all kids. And so there was a lot of, took time to get the curriculum that would be delivered at home, and then to make the accommodations and modifications that students with disabilities would need. Some of the greatest challenges we saw were getting related services provided. That, how do you make speech and occupational and physical therapy work, and counseling, and especially programs that were produced in or provided in group setting when kids are at home, and dealing with things like privacy. And you might have a counseling session that had 2 or 3 kids, and all of a sudden multiple families are dialing in, and how do you protect? So there were just some really kind of brass tacks challenges that we had to work through. And I think what we saw, and what we've read from other studies, is that a lot of trial and error of, well, let's see if this works, and well, this doesn't work, so we're going to try this. And also some of the positives we heard were families liking the virtual IEP meetings, which initially there were questions about whether they could be held, but parents feeling much better engaged and being able to engage in those IEP meetings, the individualized education program meetings, where they make the plan for how to provide services and what services would be provided. But also a couple other positives we heard was parents and teachers and students enjoying the one-on-one that the virtual and the technology provided that you couldn't necessarily create in a classroom. And also teachers and students liking the chat function, the ability to send the teacher a message and ask a specific question. So those were some of the things that we saw. With that said, school days were, when students came back to school, a lot of schools offered abbreviated school days for a couple of reasons, whether it's health and safety or staff shortages, and that we just saw fewer services. So students were getting services during the hours, but there just weren't as many hours in the day to get the services in. So that was a very practical challenge that I think we're still seeing schools are trying to address. And how do we make up for those services? And you can't, you can't pile them on. You've got to do them over a period of time when a student has lost hours of speech or occupational therapy or counseling. And so I think it's something that schools are really still wrestling with. So I'd be curious what Lindsay's seen.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with Lauren. And I think what I'd add to that is in special education, there is a theory that started, it's a professional practice that started called Universal Design for Learning. And we really saw that mode of teaching, the need for that even more now. And basically there's a lot you can do with technology. One of the first, Lauren and I both worked on it constantly at the beginning of this, because we saw a lot of people really concerned. How are you going to provide these services, these individualized services in this environment? And I personally hope we get some incredible, great examples, as Lauren mentioned, that we can really build on in the future, because we've always had problems with delivering specialized services to very rural communities or places where we don't have the number of specialists that we need. But one of the other things, one of the initial questions was, even in those districts that had Google Chromebooks or other types of devices immediately, how do I turn on the accessibility features? What do I do? And then I think throughout this, we've seen teachers and other educators become more comfortable with that and use it with their whole class. And you start to see what began as a sort of theory many years ago based on neuroscience, universal design for learning. It's a way of providing instruction through multiple means, recognizing that brains take in information in different ways. That's something we can really build upon. And so I think for states and districts going into the future, that's a very proven methodology that they could look to. The Department of Education supports that. So things like that, I think, that really were seen in the past as just for special education students. Now that we've had this incredible, we're seeing also in businesses, you see lots of people in Zoom meetings in employers turning on captions and using that, like learning using these features that you start to think, hey, this is great. I use Siri on my phone. I use all these things. And I think if states can kind of capitalize on that, we can bring forward the great parts of technology for all of our students. And that will also really help students with disabilities.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's so much in the realm of accessibility that technology can really, elevate. So using that to the benefit of all students is certainly a great thing to try to keep out of these difficult times. And Lauren, I love what you said about being able to really engage parents and families in those IEP meetings and in other instances where it may be easier for those parents to engage virtually from home rather than coming into the school during the day. So another, great accessibility engagement tool that hopefully we can keep coming out of the pandemic. And kind of digging further into the classroom experience, everyone from governors to educators to parents are really concerned about the unfinished learning and gaps that were highlighted during the pandemic. We know that there were, gaps in academic experience prior to the pandemic that were really exacerbated recently. So, what do those gaps look like for students with disabilities, and what recommendations do you have for ongoing academic recovery efforts as states are looking to spend some of these federal dollars that they have access to now, particularly as states are starting to plan for next summer? Is there an opportunity there to leverage? But welcome any of your recommendations here. And Lindsay, I'll turn it to you first.
Yeah, thank you. I think the unfinished learning, the gaps are extreme. We don't have a good sense because we don't have good data on a lot of this, which is a place where actually states could help us figure that out and help themselves. But by all of the evidence that we do have, the Department of Ed released a report early on with some preliminary evidence. The gaps are very large for students with disabilities and those from other historically marginalized communities. So it's a serious issue that is going to impact every school, no matter what that accountability system looks like. So I think one area to focus on that states must look at is summer. I think it was last May, NWEA released a report that was very interesting, and it was totally based on data before the pandemic. But what it showed was that students with disabilities experience much more extreme learning loss in the summer than other students. It also showed that many, and if not most, students with disabilities were actually on track and making bigger gains than their gen ed peers during the year. This is something that we have to look at. And honestly, from our perspective, we're thinking about that for reauthorization issues of IDEA, for funding issues. So summer is critical. We have a very strong piece of evidence that indicates that when students are without learning for long periods of time, that harms them. And we see that with students with disabilities in summer. So I would definitely encourage states to be thinking about specific programming for students with disabilities in the summer months and what they can learn to build that into future years, assuming we ever get back to normal as we go forward. I think the other thing I would just say is we need acceleration strategies. We've got a big report we did at NCLD on a couple types of those, but one thing emerged from them that was clear. And that is something that I think coming out of this pandemic, we need to know exactly what students, where are they right now in their learning? And we need to streamline standards and use something, if possible, called power standards, which individual schools can look at those. But it's basically clarifying, where do students really need to catch up? That's a place where tailored acceleration practices can come in. So those are two areas that I think states really need to be looking at or helping their districts work on: summer learning planning for that extended school year, and during the year, helping educators streamline standards, get good data about where kids are, and then focus on those areas of need.
Yeah, I absolutely ditto. I think of it as hyper personalization of really being able to drill down and figure out where kids are and then to meet them where they are. And I think thinking of state level policies is that as we think about all the needs that Lindsay and all the research I've read supports everything Lindsay has said, is that governors and state departments of ed are in a position to think about what are the preparation programs, like, go back to backward map. How do we prepare teachers and specialists? And also the mindset of that school isn't just 180 days, that is potentially year round. And how do we prepare teachers or additional staff that might be working in the summer in order to get students what they need, but also to avoid burnout? I mean, I think that we know about all the needs, and then you look at, so there's the demand, but then I look at the supply of teachers and everything. And I know we're going to have some discussion about staffing shortages, but how do you line up the supply and demand with what kids need versus what the teaching profession and the schools are able to provide? So I just think that's something that really requires some intentional thinking based on data and long-term planning.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as we see states try to grapple with some solutions with the acceleration, whether it's intensive tutoring or just offering more slots for their summer programming, all of that really does require staff. So Lauren, we can certainly jump in there next. With the current staffing shortages across so many industries also impacting the education system, how are students with disabilities disproportionately impacted by those shortages? And are you finding gaps in services, even now that students are back in school? You talked about the gaps in services when the school day was changed due to the pandemic, but now that some states feel like they're maybe back to a normal learning environment. Are there still some gaps there that you'd like to highlight for state leaders?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I don't think a week goes by when you don't read stories about, large districts starting with 1,000 open positions. And I actually had a chance to visit a school in DC last week, and we got a tour with the principal, and she was navigating, this person called in sick, this person had a positive COVID, they're in quarantine, and constantly shuffling staff. And unfortunately, when you get to that kind of triage mode, it is frequently the special ed staff that might be providing small group that are getting pulled in to just manage entire classes. So A, there's already a shortage, and B, they're getting pulled in different directions. I think again, it's hard to get out of this triage mode. But I think when, the higher you go in the policy hierarchy, to be thinking longer term and say, all the research that we have on the shortages in special ed is as much due to attrition as it is to shortage of supply, or more due to attrition. And so if we really want to stop that cycle, and some of the things that contribute to attrition is that special ed teachers don't have the preparation they need. So they feel that they can't be successful. So then they leave. Well, they've come through alternative certification, which alternative certification has a place, but we also need to have traditional, full, robust training programs for teachers to then be successful. So I think we need to think long-term about how do we make sure that the teachers we're putting in schools have the training they need to be successful. And then once they're working in schools, that the environment is created in a way to help them be successful. And that means, some of the research is that what contributes to special ed teachers leaving is feeling disconnected from general ed, feeling that their peers don't understand what they do, they don't appreciate what they do, it's all siloed. And that it really, we've devoted a lot of energy recently to looking at the role of leaders, and how do we get leaders to have a mindset of deep commitment to high expectations for kids with disabilities. And I would say inclusion runs downhill, and that if you have a leader that really believes in inclusion, and it influences their hiring decisions, their resource allocation, how they set up the building, that can create an environment that will help special ed teachers and paraprofessionals and specialists have success, and then hopefully stop the attrition. So I just think it's really important, as we look at shortages, we need to look at the entire process of training and recruiting and onboarding and retaining staff. We cannot just look at the supply. And one last thing is that I really think we need to be devoting a lot of energy to training general ed teachers. I think more so than ever, general ed teachers need to be prepared, equipped to differentiate instruction, because yes, 1 in 5 with a disability, but even now there's even greater, the learner profiles are even more varied. Kids have different needs, are coming in different places. You could have a 5th grade class, and you could have students who are reading on a 1st grade level and might have kids on the 9th grade level. And so general ed teachers really need to have a lot of tools in their toolkit to differentiate instruction. And I just feel like it's always been important, and it's even more important now. I'm curious, Lindsay, is he nodding?
Yeah, I completely agree with exactly Lauren's two of your main points. The cycle of attrition and all the places that have to be bolstered, and the fact that we've got to change the way we think about how education, and we for years have been thinking about it in a really siloed way. The special education teacher will do this. Even gen ed teachers will say, oh, there's 3 special education students in my classroom, so you deal with them. Right? We hear those stories constantly, and that just doesn't work, and it doesn't make sense anymore. I really feel like this is a place where states and governors in particular, governors have a bully pulpit, right? They can use that, and their offices can use that. The teacher shortage issue is probably educator shortage, I should say, forgive me, because it's also related services providers as well, specialized instructional support personnel. They can create partnerships with universities, right? They can create partnerships with employers. They can work with different districts. They are, in some cases in their state, the only place that can really bring together lots of people to really focus on the pipeline, as Lauren has said, and support it. And we need those new ideas. We need those collaborative partnerships in states coming together to tackle this, because the educator crisis is so so extreme. The shortage is so extreme that we aren't going to get anywhere if we can't address it. We've seen school districts, I think I'm here near Washington, D.C., and Fairfax County Public Schools last summer didn't have enough educators to provide their summer program, and so it was delayed. All of that just sets back and makes the task even larger and puts more burden on families and parents. And so if states can focus on creating, bringing attention to the issue, bringing new partners in there to help, that is exactly the kind of thing I think we need to attack an issue that's this large. And what a wonderful moment to take advantage of what Lauren just pointed out and stop the way, change the way we think about education. It's a team sport for all kids. We're seeing that right now. We need everybody in the building helping all these kids every day. There's not enough people. They've got to work together. This could be a really powerful moment to break down old sort of discriminatory silos between special education and general education and kind of carry some really profound changes into the future.
Yeah, thank you both.
Sorry,
Lauren,
I just want to, Lindsay, you made me think of something, and that is I've been having conversations with colleagues about how do we define special education? And I know legally in IDA, of course, we have that. But when we think about the experience that students have had over the last 2 years, and you walk into a classroom and you see the huge variability, what the notion of you're in general and in special ed feels very false. It feels like a forced dichotomy of either or, when I think it's much more of a continuum. And you don't want to do anything to undermine any of the rights that students with disabilities have that need to be protected. But at the same time, one of my concerns is that while I think there's going to be a delay in child find identification and the special ed numbers may be low, I have this prediction that over the next year or two, we are going to see our special ed numbers become much, much larger. And the trend is already increasing over the last 4 or 5 cycles of the civil rights data collection. We see larger and larger percentage of kids who are being identified for special ed. And I think we need to be looking at that and saying, if you're a general ed teacher and you see a student struggling, your only way to deal with that is to refer them to special ed. We have to change that mindset. We have to figure out, okay, does this child actually have a disability? Do they meet the qualifications? And if not, how do we get them the supports they need to be successful? Really ramping up multi-tiered systems of support and RTI to not lead to special ed numbers just ballooning is my concern.
Absolutely. And I love what you're saying about using this opportunity to look forward and redesign what education means, what that general education classroom looks like, and how that teacher can be prepared to meet the needs of all students, whether they have an IEP or not. There are so many lessons to be learned from the supports provided to students with disabilities, and governors in that convening role with the higher education institutions, the teacher prep programs, making sure that all educators, are prepared properly, and providing, whatever incentives we need to make sure that the staffing needs are met, and that we are getting students, all of the services and prepared adults to help them through their schooling. Is certainly a role that governors can play across the country. And in talking about the staff attrition, something that we are seeing is just the need to meet everyone's social, emotional, mental health needs during this time. The pandemic was an experience that differed for so many, but was really hard for almost everyone. And so, we know that was felt disproportionately for underserved students and students in under-resourced communities. But what are some of the holistic needs that you're seeing right now among students with disabilities? Are you seeing schools being able to re-engage them as they come back to the classroom, start to meet those needs? Or is there still some progress to be made there to make sure that they feel welcome and ready to get down to the business of academic recovery and some of that learning that also needs to happen. And Lauren, I'll turn it to you first.
I would say both and. I think that there are students who are back in schools, and I mean, I remember talking to teachers early in the school year that the students, they're like, the kids are just so excited. Like normally it was like, oh, school's starting. Now they're like, oh, we can't wait to go to school, right? So there's that, but then there's a continuum of kids who've experienced trauma, they've had loss. And that trauma and loss has not been evenly distributed. I mean, it is, you do not have to dig far into the data to see that communities of color and poor communities have been far more impacted by this pandemic than more affluent communities and white communities, to be honest. So I think addressing, and I think about Maslow, like getting the kids back in the school, getting a sense of where they are, getting an understanding of what was their experience, connecting with parents or families or caregivers to find out what was the child's experience while they were gone. And then how do we help them ease back into the school if they need it? I mean, we are hearing about behavioral challenges and that students are coming back and they're just kind of overwhelmed, overstimulated, and processing what's going on. And there's also, the pandemic is not over, the overall stress, I think it was like a weighted blanket that's kind of on us as a society or the world. And it's important to acknowledge that. And kids are feeling that in all different ways. So I think addressing their social emotional needs, understanding what they're bringing to school, what they need. And, and there's a delicate balance. It comes from knowing a kid. When do I push? When do I support? How do I give a child grace? And how do I draw some lines of accountability and expectations? Because you don't want to lower expectations so much that just anything goes. But I think, I come back to that kind of hyper personalization of one-on-one connections between an adult in the building and a child in the building to figure out where they are and to address their needs and meet them where they are. And communication is just critical, and communication with parents and families. I think that we would be missing an opportunity if we were not intentional about connecting with parents to find out where was the kid, what was their experience like over the last year, and how do we grow on that, build on that. So, and at the same time, I think there's also supporting staff. I think staff have also gone through all of these things. And so how do you make sure that staff are ready to give their best? And that includes giving staff grace and helping them navigate. On my own team, we've got families or staff members who have young children who are sick and can't get them back in childcare. And so just recognizing the overall context in which we're operating in order to keep making progress, but you don't want to lose sight of the bigger picture, I guess, in terms of just pushing forth on the academic piece.
Yeah, I agree with everything Lauren said. And I think we're all experiencing the intense, or certainly most schools in the nation are experiencing the intense reentry. It's far more intense, I think, than, who knew what to expect? I have a freshman in high school in a public school in the DC area, and there have been multiple days where there were bomb threats. There have been multiple suicides. It's been amazing to see what has happened. There have been guns in his school. There are fights in his school, and he's in a incredible system, very diverse public system. And I see the need on a daily basis to deal with that type of fear and uncertainty, and to see what happened. Wow, the sort of manifestation coming back into school of all of the trauma and how, I think we need to focus on, to me, when I see that, obviously we need to get services and supports for both the students and the adults in the building, but we need to recognize what an incredibly important place schools hold in our world and our community. And the fact that those things happened in the past, but not to this extreme extent, shows what kids lost and how important schools are to everybody, but to kids in particular, right? Of course. So to me, that's the way to kind of look at it. But I think, we saw in the ESSER application selling on something like 75% of states said we're going to focus on social emotional learning. What I would say to you for kids with disabilities is make sure they're included. This isn't a moment to say, we've got social emotional learning climate indicators, all these curriculum programs for SEAL programs for all of our students, but we put our students with disabilities are over here and they're getting positive behavior supports just focused for them. This is not a moment for that, right? Everyone needs to come together and provide and receive services from those programs. And the final thing I'll say is, we're all doing the best we can. We're seeing an incredible, the pandemic is definitely, as Lauren said, it's exacerbated for people of color, for communities in poverty, definitely, and it is continuing, as she said. I think one of the things that's concerning is in the spring, we worked with the Yale Center of Social Emotional Learning, and we looked at, they did with us a huge meta-analysis of thousands of studies of social emotional learning, and determined that very few of them actually looked at or considered kids with disabilities in the study. A lot of them didn't consider the impact of race, so they were not normed for these. So many of the things that districts are buying and using have never looked at the people that they're serving. So I think that's something for the future. States should insist that and should provide support and ask the question and ask districts to ask the question, who's included in this? Who does it work for? Who has it been normed on? Because we know that this is going to go on for years. And also they must be sure that day to day, the urgency right now is to make sure all kids are included and supported in those programs that are being implemented every day.
Yeah, I think I'm certainly taking away the importance of making sure that we are breaking some of these silos that used to exist before the pandemic. And hopefully that is a way that education is redesigned moving forward, making sure that students with disabilities are receiving all of the services and supports that they need and are entitled to, but are also considered students in the school building, just like all of their peers as well. So thank you for really detailing that. And just to close us out here, well, everyone has faced challenges during this time, especially underserved students. Let's try to end on a high note. Is there anything that you are excited about looking ahead, especially with the unprecedented level of federal funding and even state increases in funding? How can governors and other state education leaders really leverage this moment to address all of the priorities that you've discussed today? Lindsay, I'll turn to you first for a little more optimism here.
Right. Yes. I mean, to me, it's like, this is by showing us, frankly, everything we've seen in this crisis we knew before. It just wasn't as present and visible to us. But none of it is, not to diminish the pandemic, but I think that is the way to look at it positively, is there are funds to deal with situations that we've always encountered. And that could be revolutionary, right? That could really lead into the redesign. I guess we've talked about a lot today. I think the number one thing, you just emphasized, Lauren and I are, I think, really trying to hit home, is that students are students. You should be there 100% for all students. Don't segregate your students based on disability. But I would just say, on a positive note also, I think there's a real opportunity and a need to do something. I want to just emphasize a point Lauren made about educator well-being. And we won't attack shortages if we don't look at how do we really support educators in the building and create an environment that people want to work in and they feel safe in. We did a study in January of 2021. We joined with Understood and the Series Institute of Children and Youth at Boston University, and we conducted research to look at general educators' experiences during the pandemic to get some information about what do they actually need? What are they telling us they need? So we surveyed over 2,000 educators, and it was clear we should invest in resources that build teacher confidence these types of strategies, positive behavior strategies, flexible grouping and collaboration. Focus on essentials, power standards. What do they need to know? What data do they have to be able to deliver the service? Everyone who becomes a teacher wants those great magic moments in the classroom where they see students learn, and those happen with all of our students. And so making sure all of our efforts focus on student strengths. All of us have strengths and all of us have weaknesses. We really just have to get to learn what those are, understand what those are, and then lean into them. Teachers should be using this moment, and states and others can set it up to support them to do that, to bring out the best in our students and to make sure that they can do that in an environment where they're supported. So I think providing wellness resources to educators and focusing on workplace culture is equally important. And I think, just to reiterate what I said earlier, governors, state level leaders are in the place to do this. They have convening power. They have a bully pulpit. They can call big employers in their state. They can call universities and people answer the phone. So I think using this as a moment to bring together families, employers, educators, faculty could be a really powerful thing for the future and set up a great legacy for their state. I don't know how Lauren, I'd love to hear what Lauren thinks too.
Yeah, no, what a surprise. We agree on so much. Yeah, I think data technology and UDL were what I think of, technology is here to stay. Prior to the pandemic, I remember the data points was that, for the generation that are digital users from birth, basically, that when they went to school was when they were least connected to technology, and that was and that's gone. Like, that's not true anymore. So now that we've got technology, how do we embrace it? How do we leverage it? How do we make it be a tool that helps us achieve our goals? Related to technology is data. Is how do we create data systems that are used to inform? There's such a debate about high stakes testing, and I feel like testing and data have been somewhat weaponized, but really they should be used to inform decisions. And you collect data about kids, not to say good or bad, but you collect data about kids in schools to say, where do we need to drill down and work harder to improve? How do we inform our decision making? Anyone who is an athlete, you collect data on your performance and then you tweak things. You don't stop doing it. You tweak and improve and modify. And I think that states have an opportunity with these dollars to look and say, what are our data systems and are we using them, or are we data rich and information poor? And then the final thing is, and Lindsay's already talked about this, is universal design for learning. Is how do we stop thinking about general ed and special ed, and how do we start thinking about setting up systems that work for all kids? And helping them to succeed. I think the silos are not serving anyone. They contribute to the teacher attrition. So I think those are some of the big picture thoughts that I have as we move forward.
Wonderful. Well, Lindsay and Lauren, thank you both so much for sharing your insights with us today. And thank you to those who have tuned in, and please note that all of the reports and resources discussed during this webinar will accompany the recording on the NGA website, so we invite you to dig in there. And until next time, thank you for listening. We hope that you and your family stay safe and well, and have a great day.